Record in.
Well, thank you so much for everyone who's joined us for Heritage Hour tonight. I know there's lots of different ways that we can choose to spend our time online, and we're really grateful that you chose to spend your time with us at Heritage Hour tonight. My name is Dana Thoren, and I'm the Curator Supervisor at Lambton Heritage Museum. We're a community museum located near Grand Bend, Ontario. I'm going to be your moderator tonight as we're looking at the topic celebrating the women of Sarnia Lambton. With me tonight are 6 different representatives from the Heritage Sarnia Lambton Museum Network. The pandemic certainly brought a lot of challenges in the last few years, but one of the things I'm grateful for is that our Heritage Sarnia Lambton team has been able to get together virtually and deliver this programming. We did our first Heritage Hour back in May 2020, and we were looking at the impact of the Spanish flu in our local area. So it's been really great to see how many people we can reach through this virtual programming. And it's also just been nice to be able to continue to gather with my colleagues throughout the pandemic. So I'm looking forward to seeing more people in person as our museums are opening and the pandemic eases, but I'm also grateful that we can connect virtually and that we've got these speakers kind of sprinkled around Lambton County, but that can all come together and share together. This is the 7th Heritage Hour that we've presented. If you'd like to see any of the previous recordings, you can access them online at heritagelambton.ca or on the Lambton County Archives YouTube channel. I'll also be recording tonight's presentation, so if you want to share it with family and friends, or if you want to watch it again, we'll be sending out an e-blast with the link to the presentation, and that will be available online for you to watch. So on Tuesday, March 8th, we celebrated International Women's Day. It's a global day celebrating the social, economic, cultural, and political achievements of women. It also marks a call to action for accelerating gender parity. Every year has a different theme, and in 2020, the theme was Break the Bias. The International Women's Day website noted that whether deliberate or unconscious, bias makes it difficult for women to move ahead. So in 2022, we're encouraged to know that bias exists and take action to level the playing field. We want to take that global focus on the accomplishments of women and look at it in a local context. Who are some of the women and women's groups that have made a difference here in Sarnia Lambton? Our museum professionals from across Lambton County will be sharing a variety of perspectives and stories from across the county. If you have a question during the presentation, you can feel free to use the Q&A or the chat. I'll be monitoring the questions and I'll hold them all until all of our panelists have shared their presentations. And then we can look at the questions once everyone has presented. I'll be introducing each presenter as we go, and we'll finish up the evening with the Q&A, as well as some updates from our community museums. And if you really love the presentation tonight, keep an eye out for our June 16th talk in the Heritage Hour series. We'll be looking at mysterious and exceptional museum artifacts. So our first presenter tonight is Professor Greg Stott. Greg currently teaches history at University College of the North out of Thompson, Manitoba. He grew up in Arkona and has published studies on Arkona, Port Franks, and Whittier. Greg, thank you for joining us tonight, and please go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. I think it's quite frustrating that for much of the earliest decades of settler history in Lambton, that the voices of women are often very hard to find, particularly when it comes to the public sphere in terms of letters published in the local press. Women's views were supposed to be limited to the purely domestic realm. However, things were starting to change as women in different quarters began to question their legal and social subjugation to men. Given that many women in the vicinity of Arkona had roots in New York and New England, it is very probable that they were aware of a growing ferment surrounding women's rights, particularly when it came to the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, from which they would have become familiar with the work of reputations of American women such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, or the British writers like Harriet Martineau. In what became Ontario or Canada West, however, it seems that a lot of American women came up through the abolitionist movement, the anti-slavery movement, and in what became Ontario, however, it's the temperance organizations in which women were starting to find public voices and making their voices heard. Well, and one of the key organizations in the 1840s and 50s was the so-called Sons of Temperance movement. Now, officially, membership in this organization was limited to men. It was the Sons of Temperance. But female visitors were permitted. And the fact ultimately was that much of the literature suggests that despite their unofficial membership, many of the women were in the vanguard of this organization, and they were in the beginnings of what we might start to call the maternal feminist movement, which would really culminate in the late 19th century, early 20th century with getting the vote at the provincial level and then ultimately the federal level. One woman that I want to highlight tonight is a woman by the name of Catherine Stone, who was asked to write a letter outlining her view on the role of women and what the role women should take in temperance organizations and societies. So remember, temperance was about the idea of moderating, if not eliminating, the use of alcohol, which many people in the 19th century thought was the scourge of society. They thought it was this root of much evil, family breakdown, social chaos, and so on. So temperance organizations were prevalent across the region. So in May of 1860, Catherine appears to have written this letter in May of 1857, although it wasn't actually published in the Sarnia Observer until September. Catherine was clearly worried about the fact that there was a strong prejudice against women and their participation in organizations. And so she wrote, quote, "Has the wife any influence over her husband? Has the mother any influence over her sons and daughters? Has the woman any influence on the society in which she moves? Has the young lady any influence over young gentlemen? Can these questions be answered in the negative? Who in this gallant age, this age of female education and women's rights, will not dare to say, no, woman in all ages of the world has exercised a powerfully abiding influence on man, whether that influence has been exerted for good or bad purposes, and in the present age, her sway is perhaps stronger than in any former period. Show me therefore your women, and I will give you the character of your men, without even seeing them," unquote. So this is a woman. There's a couple of things that strike me about this letter. I mean, certainly she's vociferous in her opinions, and I think these are attitudes and ideas that we should hopefully at least understand in our own time. But it's interesting that in an age when many letters to the editor in newspapers were published under pseudonyms, such as a backwoodsman or employing names from classical antiquity like Orestes, I find it remarkable that this letter not only identifies the writer by her name, Catherine Stone, but that as a married woman, her name was given, she's given her first name and she's not identified as, say, Mrs. Charles Stone. I think that's extraordinarily telling and quite interesting. I should also note that I've often, as a result of this, started to wonder how many of the letters that we assume were written by men were actually potentially written by women using a pseudonym in order to get them published. We have no way of necessarily finding that out, but I think that's an interesting way of thinking about it. Unfortunately, I can't tell you much else about Catherine Stone. She and her husband, Charles, lived just north of Arkona on a farm, and her husband had been the one-time treasurer of Bezanquet Township. 3 years before she penned the letter on the role of women in the temperance organization and society as a whole, her family had been targeted on the night of September the 16th, 1854, by a brutal gang of 3 burglars who broke into their home with bludgeons called skull crackers and a dagger. They lit a candle, made their way into the master bedroom, and began to beat Catherine's husband, who resisted. However, one of the men then drew a pistol and pressed it to his chest and threatened to shoot him. Meanwhile, one of the party was rifling through a secretary and absconded with $75 worth of gold, and then fled the scene. The next day, an arrest was made of 3, quote, strange and rather suspicious looking individuals, unquote. But unfortunately, as none of the Stone family had been able to see their faces, they could not make a positive identification, and the 3 were ultimately released. On a slightly amusing note, it should be noted that the editor of the paper believed that the date had probably been incorrectly stated. It must have been the 17th, given that the 16th was a Sunday, and they assumed that even criminals would not act on the Sabbath in such a fashion. I find that rather amusing. As for Catherine and Charles Stone, unfortunately, the record seems to fall silent. I know that they left the area before 1861, but I have not been able to discover their whereabouts. One final note, I did find another letter that I quite enjoy, and it's another woman. Unfortunately, she's not fully identified. It was a letter she wrote in 1867 about concerns of women in Widder, which is the community, the defunct village that lay south of Thetford. And she wrote a letter complaining about the situation of men chewing tobacco in church. And she said that chewing tobacco made the aisles of the church disgusting and dangerous for women walking up and down the aisles. It made it for a slippery mess. And she basically suggested that this filthy habit should be ended. So these voices do appear, and I've just, and it would be interesting to find more of these voices from this era. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing, Greg. I love that quote from her letter when she says, "Show us your women and we'll show you the character of your men." That's great, thank you. Our next speaker is Nicole Azelis. She's the Archivist Supervisor of the Lambton County Archives, located in Wyoming, Ontario. Nicole holds a degree in classical archaeology with a minor in ancient languages and a postgrad in museum and gallery studies. Thank you, Nicole.
Thanks, Dana. And so today I am going to be talking about women's institutes in Lambton County. So what is a women's institute or a women's institute? For 124 years, the Women's Institute members have actively worked together for family, home, community, and country. The objective of the first Women's Institute branch was to improve women's skills in the art of homemaking and childcare. In 1919, the Federated Women's Institute of Ontario, the FWIO, was organized, giving members a stronger voice by working together as a united group. Through education and support programs and services, the FWIO's original focus expanded to include personal growth opportunities, government lobbying, and health and community wellness projects. Very broad overview, but if you're interested in learning more, you can check out the Women's Institute website of its activities today. So who were the founders? So in 1889, Adelaide Hunter Hoodless lost her son, 14-month-old John Harold, by what was thought to be drinking contaminated milk, which was a common occurrence in the era. Adelaide was devastated and she blamed herself for his death. This is when she began her campaign. Oh, my fire alarm's going off. One sec here. Sorry about that. My partner's cooking right now, and apparently it's a little smoky in the kitchen. So to continue on here, this is when she began a campaign to educate women and young girls in household management to help prevent deaths like that of her beloved son. In the years following her son's death, she promoted the importance of domestic science education in public schools. In 1896, Adelaide spoke at an agricultural conference in Guelph, which strongly resonated with one gentleman in attendance, Erland Lee. Mr. Lee invited Adelaide to speak at a ladies' night meeting of the South Wentworth Farmers Institute at Squires Hall in Stony Creek, which is near Hamilton, Ontario. Encouraged by her speech and determined to bring her message to more women, they invited her back 1 week later, and Erland and his wife, Janet, traveled around town in their cutter sleigh, hand-delivering invitations to every woman that they knew. Based on Adelaide's suggestion, a group of women and a few politically involved husbands came together after the meeting to put their inspiration into action. Janet Lee penned the Constitution for their new organization, the Women's Institute. And the first official meeting was held in Squires Hall on February 25th, 1897. Even 10 years, so by 1907, there was already over 400 branches of the Women's Institute in Ontario. So the next slide here is a list of women's institutes that existed in Lambton. Some are still active while others have folded. The light blue are districts. The purple in the bottom right are Kent County branches that we have the Tweedsmuir histories for at the Lambton Archives, and the remainder are Lambton County branches. This list is a little dated. I know there's been quite a few that have folded, and especially the last few years. On the Women's Institute website, only Aughrim was actually listed as active in Lambton County. I'm curious if this is the case. So if you know of any more that are currently active, please feel free to share it in the chat. Or if you know of ones that have closed recently, such as Thornyhurst, please feel free to share that as well. Or even if you've attended one of these meetings, it'd be great to hear. So a couple of the specific ones, I'm going to talk about Florence and Shetland. The Florence Women's Institute was organized on June 7th, 1912, with charter members Mrs. A.D. Adams as president, Lowell Walker as secretary, and 13 additional women. During their first year, the members made a motion to start a fund toward the purchase of a town hall. The Institute members and trustees were instrumental in the Township Council's decision to purchase a former Baptist church as the town hall in 1924. The Women's Institute then helped to provide furnishings, a piano, and redecorations for the hall. Over the years, the branch also provided prize money for school fairs and the Florence Fair, and they also provided a gift to each of the local soldiers who returned after World War I. They maintained the grass and gardens at the town hall and the cenotaph. The Tweedsmuir books for Florence were located at Florence Library and are currently in the Lambton County Archives. And this branch disbanded in 1990. Shetland, so the Tweedsmuir history, one of the Tweedsmuir history books for Shetland is on this slide here, was organized on February 20th, 1907 with Mrs. A.D. Adams as president, Letty Powell as treasurer, and Mrs. Milton Morehouse. The motto for the Shetland branch was, if you know a good thing, pass it on. A neat little anecdote from this branch is in its early years, they purchased a vacuum to rent to local homes on a daily basis. Now, it took 2 people to operate this vacuum. One person provided the suction by working a pump pad, while the other operated the hose that collected the dust and dirt. The members of this branch provided school children with hot dishes. They helped install hydro at the Shetland Hall, as well as a new kitchen. And they made multiple donations to local community groups. One thing I want to focus on tonight is the Tweedsmuir history, since this is one of the most common questions we have at the archives, which is, what is a Tweedsmuir history? So these histories are uniquely capture and preserve the local community history. They can be from a simple scrapbook to an elaborate series of volumes that are bound by leather, wood, or a blue gold cover. These books document the local history, and it was seen as a fitting project to mark what was the upcoming 50th anniversary of the Women's Institute movement. A campaign was launched in 1945, encouraging every Women's Institute branch in Ontario to prepare a history of their local community before the 1947 celebrations. This proved very popular, and they were officially named the Tweedsmuir History Books in 1947. These books hold an absolute variety of information, such as information on the local branch, Women's Institute branch, early settlers in the area, agricultural practices, local farms, industries, and local economy, public buildings and social institutions, such as churches, schools, community centers, family histories, and so much more. By 1964, well over 1,100 branch histories were recorded. While some of these are still in the homes of the coordinators, others are housed at local archives, libraries, museums, and other locations. In many ways, the Women's Institutes were unofficial archivists of their communities. They acquired records, oral histories, photos, and more, thereby creating an outstanding resource on rural history of Ontario. Thank you, everybody, and thank you for working with me through that little fire alarm fiasco.
I hope that the dinner is worth it.
Me too.
Well, thank you, Nicole. I liked your first slide with the snip from the Women's Institute website where they had the picture. I was like, there's so many young women in that picture. So yeah, that was nice to see. It'd be interesting to know what kind of demographics are in the remaining women's institutes. So yeah, if anyone knows more about our local women's institutes or wants to share any of their experiences, feel free to put that in the chat. Our next speaker tonight is Kailyn Shepley. She's the curator at Sombra Museum. She's been in that position since 2017. Her educational background is in languages and history, and she's currently completing a program in museum studies. Last year, Kailyn co-authored her first children's book based on experiences at Sombra Museum. Thanks for being with us, Kailyn, and you can go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you, Dana. Okay, my presentation is about women as community caregivers, focusing on women's groups as social and public health safety net in Sombra Township. But to start off, I had originally planned to do my presentation highlighting achievements of individual women of the former Sombra Township, such as Sombra Village entrepreneur and milliner Sarah Ball, and Port Lambton-born world-renowned medical doctor Maud Menton, who was one of Canada's first female MDs and was known for her work with enzymes and histochemistry. But the more I researched, the more that I saw that the story of Sombra women wasn't one of individual achievements, but was rather a story of a collective working together to care for the health and well-being of their community. So to briefly cover the founding of the Women's Institute, Adelaide Hunter Hoodless co-founded it in 1897 after the tragic death of her 18-month-old son the previous year due to drinking unpasteurized milk contaminated with tuberculosis bacterium. She felt that she'd been unprepared for her duties as a wife and mother and was determined that no woman would again go through what she did. With the Women's Institutes, Adelaide and her co-founders had the mission to educate women on a variety of issues and provide supports for women in their own communities. The Federated Women's Institutes of Ontario started the Rose Health Program, providing rural communities with vital health information like increased awareness of vital health issues, resources for the prevention of diseases, and improvements for women's health. And our local institutes definitely took up this call to assist with local health needs. So Sombra Township was home to women's institutes in Port Lambton, Sombra, Wilkesport, Beecher, and Thornyhurst. The longest lasting of these being Thornyhurst, which was founded in 1911 and closed in 2019 or early 2020. As most were founded in the pre-war years or during the First World War, early projects included knitting contests and fundraisers to send donations to the Canadian Red Cross and socks to soldiers serving in Europe to provide them with warmth, fight against trench foot, and provide food, as well as a morale boost for their mental health. When the war ended, the Sombra Women's Institute worked for the Navy League and sent garments to Byron Sanitarium. Some other initiatives of the local Women's Institute included a nursing course held by Sombra Women's Institute, where women learned how to take care of the sick, home remedies, and to make sick room diets. They also held blood donation clinics, and in 1920, the West Lambton Women's Institute group decided that each township would secure a nurse to visit each school and report on the health of the children. In 1957, the Beecher's Women's Institute formed an auxiliary at Twilight Haven in Petrolia, and members spent time there entertaining and helping patients in whatever way they could. The local institutes also collected money for various charities, such as the Cancer Society and Parkinson's Foundation of Canada. The Southwestern Area Women's Institute worked towards helping people with schizophrenia by applying for grants to research the causes of schizophrenia and improve post-hospital care for patients. The Women's Institutes locally also provided breathalyzers and blood tests for motorists, hospitalization benefits to all nursing homes, TB tests for people dispensing food, sex education in schools, and medical inspection in schools. The Beecher Women's Institute even donated $5,000 to refurbish room 204 on Ward 2 West at the Sydenham District Hospital in Wallaceburg, and a plaque was installed outside of the room with the Beecher Women's Institute inscribed on it to mark this achievement. The Thornyhurst Women's Institute made hospital gowns during 1942 to 1944, and they also ran a home nursing and first aid course for women in the community. The Port Lambton Women's Institute brought first aid kits to SS numbers 5 and 6 as one of their first efforts. They also did roll calls, talks on health, medical question boxes, courses in health, home nursing, and mental health. They made donations to Disabled Children's Funds, the Red Cross, the Society for the Blind, and worked to support tuberculosis. They also sponsored canvassing for the Canadian Cancer Society, the Blue Cross Hospital Care, and Provincial Mobile X-ray and X-rays for the township. Sombra had a mobile chest X-ray clinic for tuberculosis, and members of the Women's Institute did the clerical work and drove patients to and from the clinic. The Women's Institute also provided free cancer dressings to patients, and they collected for families who had been burned out of their homes and made quilts for each family so that they would have something to recover from their loss. In the photos, you can see there is a nurse performing a chest X-ray at the Sydenham District Hospital that was found in the Beecher Tweedsmuir book. The Wilkesboro Women's Institute with a Red Cross flag to mark their work during the First and Second World War, and members of Fort Lambton's Women's Institute at a mobile chest X-ray clinic. Next, we come to the church women's groups, or ladies auxiliaries. There were several in the area. I'm going to focus on the United Church Women and the Catholic Women's League, specifically for the St. John and Sacred Hearts churches in Sombra and Port Lambton, respectively. So the United Church Women and the St. John's Catholic Women's League were founded in 1962 and 1906, respectively. The United Church Women were grouped in Port Lambton, Wilkesport, and Sombra as a pastoral charge, and they've supported their communities through providing community meals, holding raffles to raise funds for donations to various charities and causes such as Pathways, the Cancer Society, Heart and Stroke, and fundraising for benevolent funds, which provided loans or monetary gifts to help families pay bills and stay in their homes, and also pay for healthcare and other costs such as those. They also packed Christmas baskets for the shut-ins and continue to do so this day, at least at the Wilkesboro United Church. And one of the projects of the Port Lambton Catholic Women's League was to provide funds for the Sacred Heart Food Bank, and as fundraising efforts through projects such as the annual Fowl Bingo, which was continued up until 2019 when it was shut down due to COVID-19, and hopefully will return this year. Oh, one more item about the Thornyhurst Women's Institute that I forgot to mention. They also gave financial donations to the blind, deaf, heart, and stroke and cancer. And one of the unique things that the Women's Institute did at Thornyhurst, they made sure that the local school had a clean cup and bucket for the well every school year. Now moving on to the Sunset Rebecca Lodge, started in Sombra on April 9th, 1918. It was a women's organization offshoot of the Independent Order of Oddfellows. The Rebecca Lodge had a founding degree written in 1851. Before that, spouses and family members were allowed to attend Oddfellow meetings, but weren't allowed to do fundraising and charitable efforts on their own. The Sombra Lodge, in terms of healthcare, they formed a subcommittee with the Oddfellows called the Cancer, Polio, and Tuberculosis Committee, or CPT. This is the committee that performed screenings and helped people with a request for assistance for healthcare needs. In the 1960s and earlier, the lodge would loan hospital beds, wheelchairs, walkers, and crutches to anyone in the community who had a need for such items. and they never requested any financial payment for that. Although if a free will donation was offered, they would use the free will donation to refurbish the equipment or to buy new equipment. In later years, as regulations for healthcare equipment were updated, the lodge turned over their equipment to other Odd Fellow lodges and continued to fundraise to support those efforts. And another effort to support the community health was donations to needy families. If any member of the Rebecca's knew of a family in need of food or financial assistance, the lodge would help through such means as Christmas food baskets, providing a Christmas meal for families. After some years, the service was turned over to organizations such as the Sacred Heart Food Bank, but these Rebecca Lodge would raise funds and donate money to help those causes. The lodge also hosted dances, suppers, and luncheons to raise funds and provide community goodwill and mental health supports, and they would donate any money raised back to the community for their health efforts and programs. The lodge also ran a test machine at schools. They would go into schools and test kids in certain grades for eye problems, such as myopia at East Sombra and Riverview Central schools. They couldn't diagnose issues, but if they saw certain signs of an eye disease, they would refer the family to an eye doctor to be properly diagnosed. One of their big efforts that continued until the lodge closed, until the lodge had decided to wrap up their efforts, was donating to Camp Trillium or Rainbow Lake. These were camps up north that provide a summer and all year camping experiences for children and their families who are experiencing cancer. And our local lodge even supported the building of one building there. One of the campsites is actually called All Fellows and Rebecca's Island. In addition to that, they've also donated to the Cancer Society's Heart and Stroke and local food banks. And one of their outreach activities was floats in the Sombra Parade for several years. They would get their children to dress up and pretend that they needed slings and crutches and such to advertise their CPT committee services and make community awareness for that effort. They also held fashion shows for charities using local models and flea markets, and they've offered scholarships and pilgrimages for youth to the United Nations, where youth have the opportunity to go and meet and learn about hot topics such as health and like refugee crisis and climate change, and come up with solutions for the next generation. Finally, other community groups that I wanted to just highlight quickly: the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Temperance Lodges. Although most were limited to men as members, as Greg said, there was a strong local component for women here in the community who were determined to stop the scourges of alcohol. There's not much known about them other than that the women were actively involved in the meetings. The women were also heavily involved in the formation of the Literary Society, or the Lit as it was known. They worked to promote literacy and mental health in the community through education, and formed the first library in the community. And finally, we have the local Parent-Teacher Association committees, or PTAs, in schools in the 1980s and 90s. I'm sure a lot of you would remember the mothers being trained to come in to do lice checks. And also at the local schools in Riverview and Sacred Heart in the late 1990s and early 2000s, the parent committee and the moms especially formed snack programs to provide free snacks for students who might not otherwise be able to afford a school lunch or snacks, so that they could perform better and have a healthy, nourishing meal at least one time per day. That's all for my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Kailyn. As a lot of these groups are closing or have closed over the last few years, I'd hope that all their fundraising and volunteer efforts and energy are directed elsewhere. It seems like the community would lose a lot as a lot of these groups are closing. So, thank you for sharing. Erin D. Richard is our next presenter. She's the Curator Supervisor at the Oil Museum of Canada. Prior to this, she worked in a variety of museum roles within Canada and England, including the Guelph Museums, Brant Historical Society, the Royal Collections at Windsor, the British Postal Museum, and Black Creek Pioneer Village. She holds a Master of Museum Studies from the University of Leicester and a BA Honors in History from the University of Guelph. Thank you, Erin.
Thanks, Dana. Just gonna share my screen here. All right. So you wouldn't be blamed for not knowing the name Ruth Holmes or not knowing about her incredible legacy. But if you've ever visited a museum as a kid on a school field trip or participated in a museum program similar to what we're doing here, chances are you've encountered Ruth Holmes' lasting influence on museums. Holmes is an important figure in the history of museum-based education in general, and specifically, she was instrumental in the establishment and the development of the Oil Museum of Canada. Holmes was born in Welland, Ontario in 1901, and it's through family correspondence and interviews with coworkers that we can glean a woman who was strong-willed with an independent mind and who was outspoken and straightforward. She attended University of Toronto in the 1920s, first completing her undergrad in English and history, and then a political science master's degree. Holmes began her career as head librarian for the High Park Library in Toronto. She later enrolled at Smith College in Massachusetts for a PhD. And although she didn't complete this program, she was a member of the faculty with a teaching job there. By 27 years old, Holmes was working at the Royal Ontario Museum as a lecturer, or as it was called then, instructress. She began her museum professional career at a time when the museum education profession was a very new category of employment. In 1934, Holmes received a fellowship which financed a 5-month tour of museums of the British Isles. A few years later, she was awarded a travel scholarship to study in England and Scandinavia for 2 months. It was during these trips that Holmes visited the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, where she studied museum display techniques, and attended summer school at the Courtauld Institute of Art, which is part of the University of London and specializes in the study of history and art and conservation. This European exposure led to Holmes' brilliant programming ideas, which she fought to implement at the ROM and more easily implemented in small museums across Ontario. Holmes' goal was to make history relevant to a wider audience. Her outspoken passion for her museum educational vision often brought her to loggerheads with department directors at the ROM while she was an instructress there in the 1930s. The conflicts were most often rooted in the differing beliefs of who museums are actually for. The ROM directors strongly believed that the museum was purely an extension of the university and that public education merely consisted of supporting university-level academic study, period. But Holmes was committed to opening the museum up to new audiences previously neglected by the museum directors, namely children and a popular audience. Holmes' museum educational vision was one of informal learning that would attract a more diverse visitor. To this end, Holmes ushered in a more accessible object-based learning and strengthened the idea of the museum as a space to support teachers in activity-focused curriculum. Holmes left her position with the ROM in 1946 when the ROM directors were finally beginning to value the importance of the newly formed Museum Department of Education. However, rather than looking to Holmes to lead this department that she and the other instructresses like her successfully championed, they sought to hire a quote-unquote suitable man to undertake the duties of supervisor of museum outreach, someone to whom Holmes could turn to for advice at any time. The man they ended up hiring was a curator of mammalogy at the ROM with absolutely no background in museum education. Holmes quit because she said she objected to having a man put over her. The job loss was a blessing in disguise because by this time, Holmes' enthusiasm and passion for museums had spread throughout Ontario, and she was sought after by local communities to develop their museums. Along with the Oil Museum of Canada in 1960, Home planned the Wellington County Museum at Elora, the Hiram Walker Historical Museum at Windsor, now the Windsor's Community Center, the United Counties Museums in Cornwall, now the Cornwall Community Museum and Archives, Lennox and Addington Museum at Napanee, and the Jordan Historical Museum of the 20, now the Lincoln Museum and Cultural Center. Home was retained locally as a consultant in 1956 by the Lambton County Historical Society's Museum Committee to plan the new oil museum. She was hired because she was a significant member of the Ontario Historical Society and was well-versed in this type of museum work. Once the building was built, Home organized the exhibits. She aimed for high quality and recommended top companies and artists to design and execute the displays and worked closely with them. Home also instructed the museum committee to implement some of her education programs, which she was known for at the time, and to develop a lecture series. Due to the museum's proximity to the border, she anticipated that the museum would be hosting thousands of tourist visitors, and they would need to offer general guided tours to bus groups and schools. She was right. During Home's career, she founded many of the educational programs that today are central to museum education, such as open evenings, public lectures, film series, outreach initiatives, curriculum-focused programs, and hands-on weekend and summer programming that centered on blended teaching methods. On her death in 1965, she was remembered in the popular press as one of the first trained curators of the province. She was passionate about museums and for accessible multi-sensory learning for children and adults of all class backgrounds. In the Oil Museum's recent renovations, we intentionally revisited the original exhibit themes laid out by Home and the Museum Committee with updated interpretation and interactive activities. Home has made her mark here at the Oil Museum of Canada. On a final note, when the Oil Museum opened in 1960, the board wanted a custodian of quality. They knew they'd have to pay well to secure such a person as in this position as curator. Beatrice McLaughlin is often mentioned as being the museum's first curator, when she was in fact the second curator of the museum. During my research on Ruth Holmes on this topic, I discovered that the first curator was a woman named Vera Seals, formerly of England and a resident of Petrolia. She was active in local business life and was a secretary of the local Chamber of Commerce. And, oh, I lost my place. And the Chamber of Commerce. And this photo here, I just wanted to bring to it, is the only photo I believe that we have of Miss Seals, and it's sadly of the back of her head. But she was here for such a short amount of time, and that's probably why she's been overlooked here. But McLaughlin started at the museum in 1961 in its second season. She was a farm wife and mother of 4 with no experience, as she put it. She just applied and was accepted. McLaughlin was the curator of the Oil Museum of Canada for 18 years and retired in 1979, and was quoted in the paper at the time very pragmatically saying, "When the time has come, what is the sense of staying on when you can just step down?" That's all I have.
Thank you very much, Erin. I see a comment in the chat from Tracy who said, anyone remember the little bottles of crude oil you could buy at the Oil Museum? A visit to this museum was always a grade 5 field trip. There's definitely lots of people who have fond memories of their school field trips to the Oil Museum. Thank you. Our next presenter tonight is Lori Mason. Lori has been the curator of Moore Museum for over 35 years. She holds a Bachelor of Arts and Bachelor of Education degrees from Brock University, as well as a certificate in museum studies from the Ontario Museum Association. Moore Museum began in 1975 in the former Moretown School and has grown over the past 45 years to a 13-building community museum showcasing the social, agricultural, and marine history of the former Moore Township section of St. Clair Township. This will be Lori's last time presenting with us as she is retiring at the end of April. So thank you, Lori, for being a part of our Heritage Hour, and we look forward to your last talk.
There we are. little technical difficulty there. Well, thanks, Dana. Good evening, everyone. My portion this evening is entitled Women as Community Builders. One foundational way in which many women have been involved in building community is through the education of the next generation, be that their own children at home or as teachers of the children in the community. From the 1880s onward, the majority of elementary school teachers in Ontario have been women. This in spite of the fact that they consistently earned less than their male counterparts and that only single women were allowed to teach. It wasn't until the post-Second World War baby boom that a teacher shortage allowed married women to be more likely to be teachers. In 1941, only 5% of female teachers were married, but by 1951, this had increased to 28%. An example of the esteem in which a teacher was often held is found in Moore Museum's archival collection in the form of a letter that was given to Miss Ida Robbins in 1899 from the students of SS number 15 Moore at Kimball. And the letter begins, "For the past 2 years, you have been our guide and helper, and by your kindness and patience with us in all the trying hours of school life, you have won our love and esteem. And we take this opportunity of expressing our regret at having to be separated from you." It would appear that Kimball School attracted teachers with a sense of adventure because the reason for this parting was that Miss Robbins had accepted a teaching position in the Northwest Territories in the area that would later become the province of Alberta. And that, I think, would have seemed a long way from Moore Township in 1899. Ida Robbins' work in the West must have been a short-term contract, however, because by 1901 in October, she married William Henry Marsh back here in Lambton County. Likewise, another teacher from Kimball School left teaching at Kimball to head to a far distant place. Miss Barbara Johnston taught at Kimball School in 1907 and 1908, but left for the mission field in India in 1908. When I noticed that we had a picture from Kimball School in 1908, I hoped it was she in the picture, but unfortunately this was taken in the fall after she had left the school. The first Canadian Pentecostal missionary to India, Barbara Johnson worked in Bible translation and also in an orphanage. She married John Norton in 1909 in India. Sadly, though, she passed away just 3 years after her arrival in India. There's a cemetery stone for her at Lakeview Cemetery in Sarnia. When I first heard of Miss Johnson as a missionary, I was amazed that a woman at a time when generally women's role was considered to be the home. I was surprised that a woman would have headed out on such an adventure. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, however, many women were, in fact, going to other countries as Christian missionaries, not as wives of missionaries, but as single female missionaries in their own right. Their responsibilities included evangelism, preaching, teaching, and healthcare. They also assumed roles in administration. Some of them became directors of institutions, something that would have been virtually unattainable for a woman in Canada at the time. Before centralization of schools in Moore Township in 1963, the majority of the 18 school sections were served by one-room schools. So the teachers would often have a long impact on the children's education. They might teach the children more than 1 year. In fact, might have taught them for their entire elementary schooling. A local example of this was Mrs. Lillian Sinclair, who taught at Burke Hall School just north of Brigden for 20 years. And when the school closed in 1963, Mrs. Sinclair was presented with this painting of the school by local artist Edwin Johnson. Nursing was another role in which women served their community. This invitation to the 1933 graduating exercises at Sarnia General Hospital Training School for Nurses shows 2 Moore Township residents among the 13 graduates. A demanding career in any situation, many women did serve in war situations as nurses. Lorene Morwick from Broomfield was a captain in the US Army Nursing Corps, and she served in both North Africa and in Italy. And sadly, there was danger in nursing even in times of peace. Miss Marion Carter of Moore Township died of typhoid at the age of 22 after serving as a nurse to a child in Corunna who was ill with the disease. She had graduated from the Sarnia General Hospital School of Nursing in 1938. And throughout Moore Township's history, women have also worked together in groups to build community. Many of the organizations were begun by and operated by women. Perhaps the best known is Women's Institute, as been mentioned by a couple of the other speakers this evening. Locally in the former Moore Township, there were 9 branches of the Women's Institute: Burke Hall, Brigden, Corunna, Courtright, Broomfield, Moore Center, Plum Creek, Providence, and Willow Grove. The earliest was Corunna, which was established in 1914, and the longest running was Moore Center, which operated for 93 years. Moore Center Women's Institute operated a community hall. It had contributed to the building upkeep since 1920, and in 1956 the building was given to the Women's Institute by the Township Council. Since then, all the Women's Institute branches in Moore Township have since closed. I think, however, there's often a misconception that women's groups were mainly social in function, a way for homemakers and mothers to get out of the house and get together. And I think, what has been presented tonight shows that there was a lot more to it than that, a lot more influence on the community. The Women's Institute, for example, lobbied the government on things as diverse as stopping for school buses and taking staples out of food packaging. And a major project, of course, of the Women's Institute were the Tweedsmuir Histories, as Nicole mentioned, and those are the most extensive form of women in the role of community memory keepers. But some other things that women's groups did, mainly intended as fundraisers, but they have a secondary function as community memory keeping. For example, autograph quilts, where people at a church or community would pay to have their names embroidered on a quilt, gives us ideas of the names of families in the different parts of the community. And another example is the cookbooks that were produced by church groups or other women's groups, and the names of the women who submitted each of the recipes was included. So it gives us some idea of other names of families in those communities. At other times, women have banded together for specific causes during both world wars. Women have formed war effort groups. In Moore Township, there was the Brigden War Service Committee, and the work of that was covered in the November 11th, 2020 webinar. So if you didn't see that one, you can check back and see that one. There was also the Moretown Patriotic Society, and this group made clothing for the war effort, but something else they did, which has also had a real benefit in terms of having us have more information about our local history, is they produced this booklet, The History of the Village of Moretown, written by Moretown historian Isabella Finlayson, and it was published by the Moretown Patriotic Society in the interests of war work. And just to end off on kind of a fun fact about a trendsetter in our community, in 1954, Moore Township resident Dorothy Hayward made legal history when she was sworn in as the first woman to serve on a jury in Lambton County. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lori. Our final presenter tonight is David Mclean, who is representing the Forest Museum. David is a retired high school history teacher who taught for 31 years and is currently a volunteer with the Forest Museum and the Plimpton, Wyoming Museum. He holds an honors BA in history from Huron College and a Bachelor of Education from Althouse Teachers College. So, thank you, David.
Thank you, Dana, and good evening, everyone. So I'll just there we go. All right, my presentation is on Dr. Rosalyn Morris. So Dr. Morris was a former resident of our area who became a world-renowned cytogeneticist and educator. And I'll explain what a cytogeneticist is later, all right? Dr. Morris and her family came from Wales. A place called Ruth in Wales is where Rosalyn was born on May 8th, 1920, to school teachers Aneurin and Celia Morris. Besides Rosalyn, the Morrises also had another child, a son named Penry. He was known as Penry. William Penry was his name, but Penry is what he was known as, who was born in 1923. And it was in 1925 that the family immigrated to Canada. And they did so on the advice of a Nurin doctor. And Nurin, the father, had fallen victim to the Spanish influenza in 1918. And as he continued to suffer from the effects of his illness, his doctor recommended he take up, quote, an outdoor life. And likely influenced by promotional posters, like these ones here, that encouraged British citizens to immigrate to Canada, and Nurin decided to purchase a 50-acre fruit farm on the 12th concession of Plympton Township, just a short distance to the southwest of Forest. And if you know where Roland's greenhouses are, this is right next door to there, just to the west, all right? So Rosalyn later described the years growing up on the family farm as a happy period in her life. Both she and Penry did their share of work on the farm. When not studying, Rosalyn later recounted, she helped to harvest asparagus and raspberries, cleaned the chicken pens, and gathered eggs and fed several dogs. In her teen years, she became increasingly involved in farm operations. In spring, she drove a Florence tractor while her father sprayed apple trees. In the fall, she helped to pick and sort apples. Now, both Rosalyn and Penry attended high school here in Forest. And in 1938, Rosalyn graduated with the highest marks in the county. And with her parents' strong academic backgrounds, there was no question about whether she would attend college. Rosalyn decided not to become a journalist, however, as she had originally intended, but instead chose to major in horticulture with the intent of becoming a fruit tree breeder. And when she was graduating from high school, the Great Depression was still on, and it is apparent that the family business may have not been doing so well. According to Rosalyn, quote, following the Depression years, my family could not afford a prestigious university. So we chose the Ontario Agricultural College in the city of Guelph, about 130 miles from home. Now, it was rare in those days for women to pursue an academic career in agriculture, but Rosalyn excelled in her studies and received her Bachelor of Science and Arts in 1942, whereupon she was accepted into the plant breeding graduate program at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. And this is a photo from when she was still in Guelph at the OAC. So she was accepted at Cornell, but Rosalyn took a bit of time out from her studies and decided to do her bit for Canada's war effort. World War II, of course, it began in 1939. And she served briefly in England with the Canadian Women's Army Corps at this Red Cross hospital. Okay. Meanwhile, Rosalyn's brother, Penry, also answered the call, enlisting in the fall of 1941 and making his way overseas, whereupon he was attached to the Royal Air Force as a navigator and warrant officer with number 550 Squadron. Sadly, during a bombing mission over Germany in January of 1944, he was killed when his Lancaster bomber was shot down. Now, although his name appears on his parents' tombstone here in Forest at Beechwood Cemetery, Penry is buried at the Venray War Cemetery in Holland. And in 1997, Rosalyn established a memorial scholarship in honor of her brother, which is awarded to North Lambton Secondary School students. Returning from her overseas service, Rosalyn took up her studies at Cornell, where out of 150 students in her class, only 5 were women. As a graduate student, Morris initially studied fruit plant breeding, but transitioned to the study of crop plants. She assisted her advisor with small grains research and conducted her own research on buckwheat. However, seeing chromosomes under a microscope in a cytology course captivated her interest and changed her career path. Upon her graduation in 1947, she and classmate Leona Schnell had the distinction of being the first women to receive PhDs in plant breeding and genetics from Cornell University. Rosalyn thereafter accepted a faculty position at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, becoming the first woman faculty member hired by the agronomy department. At the University of Nebraska, she worked on an Atomic Energy Commission grant in the newly created plant cytogenetics program. So here's the definition of cytogenetics. It's the branch of genetics that studies the structure of DNA within the cell nucleus. So in the aftermath of the dropping of the atomic bombs in Japan in 1945 and the horrific devastation they caused, there arose a great interest on the impact of nuclear radiation on all life forms, including plants. And they were looking, we saw the devastation of what happened from these bombs, but they were looking, was there any positive effects or any positive uses of radiation, I guess. Rosalyn's studies focused on the cytogenetic effects of atomic irradiation on corn. In 1956, she spent 9 months conducting research in Sweden and England on a Guggenheim Fellowship. After returning to Nebraska, she changed her research focus from irradiation effects to the cytogenetics of bread wheat. Her work helped researchers study the effects of single chromosomes on hardiness, fruit tolerance, flour quality, protein quantity, and other variations in winter wheat. It was a joy for me, she said, to sit at the microscope and look at those beautiful chromosomes spreads. My research was based on the misbehavior of chromosomes and took a lot of patience and persistence. At least in the early years of her time at the University of Nebraska, the faculty was dominated by males. But Dr. Morris maintained that she did not have a competitive attitude with respect to her colleagues. Rather, her approach as the only female member in the department was to, quote, demonstrate that I was qualified based on my professional accomplishments to be a faculty member in agronomy. Despite any potential gender bias in her department, Dr. Morris succeeded and eventually rose to the position of full professor. And she held that position from 1958 until her retirement in 1990. During her lifetime, in recognition of her numerous achievements, Dr. Morris received many honors and awards. I will just highlight a few of these. In 1979, she was the first woman honored as an American Society of Agronomy Fellow. In 1985, she was named a Fellow of the Crop Science Society of America. And she also served as the president of the Nebraska Academy of Sciences. Now, in 1990, Rosalyn retired from the University of Nebraska, but remained active in pursuing her interests in travel, nature, and environmental protection. And I'll just finish this off by saying I was thrilled when, in 2020, after some internet sleuthing, I managed to make contact with Dr. Morris. And along with the municipality of Lambton Shores, the Forest Museum sent her best wishes on the occasion of her 100th birthday. Not long after, I received a very sweet card right here of thanks from her with an expression of her fond memories, with an expression of her thanks and her fond memories of growing up in Lambton County. And this May, Dr. Morris will be celebrating her 102nd birthday. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, David. She's such an inspiration. Thank you. I am going to share just a quick resource with everyone if you're interested in learning a bit more about the Women of Lambton County. You can check out the Lambton Heritage Museum website, and we have a virtual exhibit on the Women of Lambton County. So if you go to heritagemuseum.ca, and then under our exhibits tab here, you scroll down to virtual exhibits. It's the third one here. So Shine Spotlight on Women of Lambton. So this was an exhibit we presented back in 2013. And we've taken a lot of the pictures and content from the exhibit and made it into a virtual exhibit. So feel free to browse that. It's organized by different categories. So if you want to learn about how the roles of women have changed in society, you can read a little bit of background and then click on the subtopics to go a bit more into detail on the different themes. And there's links to other resources and photographs from our collection and a lot more information there. So if you have an interest and a moment, make sure that you check out the Women of Lambton virtual exhibit. Before I address any questions, I'm just going to provide a few updates from our community museums. Here at Lambton Heritage Museum, it's tundra swan time. The annual tundra swan migration is in full swing. I saw hundreds of swans on my way to work this afternoon. So they're flooding the fields along Greenway Road just behind the museum grounds. So if you bring your binoculars, pull over your car, you can have a look at these amazing tundra swans. If you visit while the museum is open, you can come in and see our pop-up exhibit about the tundra swans. At the Oil Museum of Canada, they are finally open to the public after being closed for renovations in 2021. I've had a chance to go see the new exhibit and it is absolutely amazing. So please make time to go because the team did an incredible job. They're holding a reopening celebration on May 27th. Oil Museum members will receive a special invitation to that event. Also on May 19th, they're hosting a virtual talk with author Gary May about his new upcoming book, Crude Genius. That book examines the fascinating life of international driller William McGarvey. Check out their Facebook page for details closer to the talk. As part of Archives Awareness Week in early April, the Lambton County Archives is hosting a talk on April 7th at 7 p.m. titled The Baldoon Mystery with presenters Rick Fair and Christopher Lawson. This is a well-known story detailing Canada's oldest and most widely reported poltergeist. The events of the story happened in late 1829 and early 1830 and have been the subject of great folkloric interest. The archival record reveals fascinating insights about the events in early Sombre Township, where everything happened. Details of the Baldoon mystery are strange, yet many of the historical facts are equally compelling. The presenters will explore some of the oddities hidden in the archival record as they piece together a more comprehensive understanding of the Baldoon mystery. Also ongoing at the Lambton County Archives is the History of Lambton Concert Bands exhibit in the Sarnia Library Theatre lobby. It'll be on until May 5th. You can add to the experience by going to a live concert at the Sarnia Library. We can do that again. They're doing weekly Thursday night Rhythms of Lambton County concert series. You can visit the Lambton County Archives website page, to their events page to learn more about who's playing and how to register for those upcoming events. Moore Museum is excited to open for the 2022 season and look forward to welcoming everyone for a visit. They're open Monday to Friday, 9 a.m. to 4 p.m., but they'll be open on weekends starting in May. Other exciting news is that the Downriver Craft and Gift Sale will be returning this year. This event will take place on Sunday, September 18th, and vendor applications will be sent out next week. For more information, you can check out the museum's website, moremuseum.ca, or follow them on Facebook or Instagram. And I also have a note from the Forest Museum. They have been busy with a major reorganization and are looking forward to opening their doors to the public in late May for the first time in 2 years. Congratulations to the Forest Museum. And a grand reopening will be held in June. And they still have a few of their 2022 calendars for sale. So, oh, David's got a picture of it there. So yeah, it's a great calendar with lots of wonderful images from Forest in the area. So you can check out their websites for details on how to purchase those. Yeah, so I'm happy to take questions now. There had been a question earlier about women's institutes and whether they were inspired by the British Women's Institute movement or had kind of cropped up independently in Canada. If anyone wanted to speak to that.
Sorry, I believe that in fact, Adelaide Hoodless's organization was spread to the rest of the English-speaking world. So I think it's a Canadian institution that was exported to Britain and other parts of the English-speaking world. Sorry, I'm not an expert, but that's my understanding.
Yes, that's what I found as well.
And someone did ask in the chat for a link to the presentation. And we will be posting the presentation on YouTube in the next few days. And we'll send out an email to everyone who is registered for the talk where you can, where you'll be able to access that link. So it will certainly be available for people to watch again or to share. And thank you to everyone for their kind comments in the chat. Yeah, I'm not seeing any more particular questions.
Dana, did you get the one about the painting?
Um,
In the Q&A, I think someone was referring to the painting over your left shoulder.
I
I wanted
did,
to know
yeah.
the artist.
Yes, the artist is Barbara McLeod, and she was part of our Paint Ontario art show and sale last year. And she did an artist demonstration, and this was the work that she painted out back on our museum grounds. It shows the Rokeby School and the Cameron Church. And then she very graciously donated it to the museum when she was done painting. Well, we have gone over our time, so I'll just take a moment to thank all of the presenters for being with us tonight. And yeah, always great to see everyone together, and thank you to everyone who took time to spend with us tonight. So have a wonderful evening. Thank you.